This message has been brought to you from the Landscape Certified Contractors Association. If you would like to be a part of our membership, please go to our website, irrigatortech.com.
Introductions, and I'd like to introduce some guests that we have here today, elected officials. So please, if you could signal your presence when I call your name, we can recognize you. From the city of Hemet, Mayor Linda Krupa. We also have a council member from the city of Eastvale, Clint Larimore. Oh, yeah, Clint gets a hand. That's good. Council member Jeffrey Giba from the city of Moreno Valley. Welcome. Director Phil Pauly from the Great Eastern Municipal Water District. Director David Clausen from Eastern Municipal Water District. Director Ron Sullivan from Eastern Municipal Water District. Also from Elsinore Valley Municipal Water District, Director Nancy Horton. Director Stephen Anderson from Harupa Area Park and Recreation District.
Yay!
Also from Elsinore Valley Municipal Water District, Director George Cambero. George, welcome. Thank you for coming today. Director Ken McLaughlin from Harupa Community Services District.
Yeah.
Director John Butler from Lee Lake Water District. Welcome. Thank you. Good to see you here today. Director Russ Martin from Mission Springs Water District. Thank you for joining us out here today. Director Jack Hoagland from Rancho California Water District. Jack, welcome. Director Ron Cole from Riverside Public Utilities District. Ron, thank you for coming today. Also, we have some legislative staff here. We have Denny Horn from Office of Assemblywoman Melissa Menendez. She's in the back there. Sitting next to her is Alti Holcomb from Office of Senator Richard Roth. Alti, welcome. Jaime Hurtado with Office of Supervisor Marion Ashley. Jaime? Oh, he gets a big hand. And then Zach Weibert from Office of Supervisor Marion Ashley. Zach, welcome. Also, is there anybody here who'd like to introduce maybe a guest who has not been here before? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Wait, sir.
Oh, yes.
We have Jose Medina's representative.
Sabrina Cervantes with Assembly Member Jose Medina.
Oh, thank you very much. Sorry we missed you on your today. Well, very good. We have a great program today, and you know, as I think in the last few weeks have been focusing on the governor's executive order and focusing on how are we going to meet between 25 and 35% cuts in our water use, and there's been a lot of things on everything from that to the recent finding in court on the San Juan Capistrano rate. So there's been a lot going on in the last couple of weeks. But one of the things, obviously, that's been an ongoing issue for us for a long time in the water business, and something that we're still committed to, is resolving the issues in the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary. The BDCP has gone through some substantial public review. That project is being looked at right now by the state and the major players on the state water project to see what things can be changed to make that more successful. And so there's some considerations that are being looked at as the project moves forward. But obviously the BDCP has a very significant effect here, on us here in Southern California. Not only in stability in our water supplies, but also in improvements in our water quality. And we've talked about that before and how important that is for us in the long run. So today we have an expert on the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary and the Delta. And excuse me for a second, I need to grab something. Thank you. And a really great presentation. Curt Shmutte is a consultant with the Metropolitan Water District. I've seen Curt's presentations before, and he has a very high degree of expertise. I consider him one of the premier experts on the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary and the Delta issues. And I think you'll really enjoy his perspectives on the Delta and the background that he provides. It really gives you a good understanding of what we need to be looking at with the BDCP and improvements to the environment in the Delta. Curt's a civil engineer, and he's a manager specializing in water resources development. As I said, he's currently a consultant for the Metropolitan Water District. And he worked prior to Metropolitan, where he started in 2006 with the Department of Water Resources for 21 years. He's led multiple programs when he was with DWR pertaining to the Delta, in particular land subsidence research, levee improvement programs, economic risk analysis, dredge material reuse projects, water quality studies, environmental restorations. But other than that, he doesn't know anything about the Delta at all. But since joining Met, he's been really looking at large-scale ecosystem restorations projects. And of course, that's a key part of a successful Bay Delta conservation plan. So with that, I'm going to introduce and have Curt Shmutte come up and give our presentation. We did have a late arrival. I want to recognize Director Brenda Denstedt from Western Municipal Water District. Thank you, Brenda, for joining us. So, Curt, please.
Thanks, Paul. Can everybody hear me okay with this voice? Well, good morning, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And as Paul mentioned, I've been working in the Bay Delta system for a very long time, about 25 years. And what I'd like to do, and what I have done repeatedly, is given a talk about how the Delta in its current form is not sustainable. But what I was asked to talk about today is more about the historic Delta. And so it's been a real pleasure for me to go back and actually create a new presentation that delves into what the Delta used to look like. Some of these animations are brand new. You're some of the first people to see them, talking about and showing you how very, very different the Delta used to be compared to what it is today. So I'm going to start back. We're going to go way back to the last ice age, and we're going to come forward and we're going to talk about how the Delta has changed, and then how, basically, by knowing the past, better understanding the future. But with that, why don't we get started? So we're first going to fly into California and the Bay Delta system. So Central Valley, San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge. This is the Bay Deltas we have today. So San Francisco Bay, San Pablo Bay, what we call the Carquinez Strait. This is the Suisun Marsh over here on the right. And then we're coming into the Delta. So that's the Sacramento River here. And here's the San Joaquin River, Sherman Island. Sacramento's way up here, just off the top of the screen. Stockton way off to the right. That's Frank's Tract. And that is a quick fly-in to the Delta we have today. But it hasn't always been that way. If you go back 10,000 years to the last ice age, San Francisco Bay wasn't a bay, but it was a valley. The two major rivers, the Sacramento and San Joaquin, used to flow out together here through the San Francisco Valley. Here's San Francisco, well out past the Farallon Islands to get to the beach. So sea level was some 300 feet lower than it is today. So we're in this 10,000 year, at the end of an interglacial period. We're ready to start a new ice age. I don't know if you remember back about 30 years ago, there was a big talk about that we're entering the next ice age. And sea levels were going to start dropping and temperatures. Anyway, our last interglacial period was actually higher sea levels than we have today. So we experienced that. So anyway, this is what the Delta used to be, was two rivers, not a delta. And then 200 years ago, the Delta and the bay were large tidal marsh areas, both brackish, saltwater as well as freshwater marshes. And what you can see from this panel on the left versus the right is how extensively those wetlands have been destroyed. In the Delta, we only have about 2% of the remaining wetland that once existed in the system. And the fish that we have in the Delta evolved in that system that we had 200 years ago. 200 years ago, we've lost in that 200 years since the Delta used to look like this on the map here, which was a vast wetland. We've lost 5 mammals, 7 birds, 7 insects, 9 birds, and Of the 29 native species that used to exist in this system, we only have, or 12 of those species have been eliminated. So a little bit about the ecology of the system that used to exist. So now I'm going to briefly walk you into different parts of the delta. So the delta historically, today the delta is pretty much a monoculture. It's all the same. If you're a fish in the delta today, if you don't like it, tough luck, it's all the same. But in the delta historically, the delta was a very different place in the central delta, the north delta, as well as the south delta. So the central delta, which is this part of the delta right here, had a high degree of tidal influence. Very sinusoidal channel systems, tidal wetlands, freshwater tidal wetlands, and willow fern swamp. If you went into the North Delta, it was very, and I'll show you a cross-section of what, and show you some pictures of what we think the North Delta used to look like. But the North Delta was really dominated by winter flood systems coming down the Sacramento River system, and it used to just inundate the rivers would flow over the banks and just inundate that part of the North Delta. And it had large riparian forests, and I'll show you what a riparian forest looks like in a second. It had very few channels in that system. In the South Delta, different system altogether again, because unlike the Sacramento River, which was really a rain-dominated system, in the South Delta it was a snowmelt-dominated system. So most of the flooding occurred in the late spring and in the summer, in July. You get the peak floods coming into the South Delta in June and July, and consequently that had a different system as well. A lot of backwater ponds and beaver dens that used to exist in that system. So here's what a riparian forest looks like. Very little of this remains in the Delta today. Our historical accounts are that if you were an early explorer or you wanted to go from San Francisco to Sacramento prior to the development of the Delta, you had a hard time finding the entrance to the Sacramento River because it was so narrow and the riparian forest was so overgrown covering the river. The river was a very narrow river back then. Here's an artist's drawing of what the North Delta used to look like. Again, you see these large woody willow, oaks, cottonwood trees growing out over the channel system. Complex forest. Here's a cross-section of the North Delta channel system. You can see the river, the Sacramento River, is deeply incised, relatively narrow. You have these half-mile wide riparian zones, a lot of alders, sycamores, and then on the backside you would have these flooded ponded areas, tules, freshwater cattails. And here's a picture, and this is the only place you can find this in the entire Delta, of what that probably looked like. You got the tules here and a big riparian forest in the background, showing you what that may have looked like 200 years ago. And the channel system has changed. One of the things I find very amazing, work that was done by the San Francisco Estuary Institute, is the historic Delta had over 5,000 miles of channels in the system. And here are just a few of those channels in red. And you compare that with the channel system on the right, in the upper right, showing the current Delta system, and you'll see that we went from 5,000 to about 700 miles of channels. And that's had a significant impact on the variability in the Delta. Temperature, depth, turbidity, salinity, resonance time, and velocity gradients, as I've implied, have changed considerably. And this used to change considerably in this system. And in this system, it's very much a monoculture. Here's just a close-up of the South Delta, showing, again, how those channel systems have changed from 200 years ago to the day. You can see in the Central Delta, here's the San Joaquin River, and this array of channel systems, all very braided, sinusoidal, kind of like the branches on an oak tree. When you compare that with this map on the right, the current Delta, and you see how many of these channels have been eliminated or straightened. Every time you see a straight line in the current Delta, that is a channel that didn't used to exist. Matter of fact, one of the things that I find very interesting is there's a channel here they call False River. And I always wondered, why did they call it False River? And if you look back historically, the river it was a really wide tidal channel that used to come in and dissipate into a tidal marsh. And it didn't connect to the San Joaquin River. So it used to come through here and stop. And the early explorers would go up into this thinking this was the San Joaquin River, and then they'd have to turn around and go back out because they hit a dead end. Well, eventually, the early farmers connected this false river to the San Joaquin River, so no longer a false river connects through. I found that interesting. So here's a picture, a rare photo of what we think the Central Delta used to look like. This is tidal marsh. These are tules. These grow about 12 feet tall. If you get rid of the cooling towers and the stacks in the back, we think the delta was probably about 400,000 acres of this in various forms, with willow groves and sycamores as well along the main channels. But this was really a dominant species in the delta. I've been out in this in a small boat, and you stand up in a small boat and you barely see over the tops of these tules. And a friend of mine once said, you know, you feel primordial. You feel like you've gone back to the time of dinosaurs when you're out in this stuff. And you can only imagine what it would have been like 200 years ago. Here's a black and white photo, again, of the Central Delta. I colored it in to show you what that looks like, used to look like. Channels were very sinusoidal. These willow groves along the remnants, historic tidal channels or levee systems. And we think this kind of habitat is extremely important for the native salmon population, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Now I'm going to, giving you that little bit of background, I'm going to fly you into the delta as we think it used to exist 200 years ago. So here we go. We're going to head from San Francisco back up towards Sacramento. This is the Sacramento River, the San Joaquin River. On the right, this is Sherman Island. And what you'll notice is a lot of channels, relatively small channels that used to exist compared to the big channels today. But a very wild place. In the Suisun Marsh, historic accounts, in 1 year they killed over 100 grizzly bears. Tule elk, it was just antelope, many beaver. So what happened starting in the 1860s, by decade, this shows you how the delta was reclaimed for farming. So by the time we got to the 1930s, that former wild tidal marsh area had been all drained, 98% of it drained. And this is the delta we have today. We're going to fly in and take a closer look at the delta as it is today. And then this is a cornfield on Staten Island. You pop up over the levee, and you'll see that the water on the other side is quite high relative to the land surface elevation. These channels are narrow. They provide very little habitat. There's just a few clumps of tules along the edge. Nothing like that riparian forest and what we call channel margin habitat. So one of the things we want to try to do is restore, in the future, we want to restore some of that. We can't restore it all. We can never go back to what it once was because of the subsidence, but restore parts of this system to what it used to be in terms of function and processes that used to exist. And the extent of this, we need to do this in broad corridors. We can't do patchwork. We have to do continuous bands of these types of habitats to make them fully functional. So this is a conceptual illustration to show you the kinds of continuous bands of habitat that we need to create the processes that used to exist 200 years ago. So just a few still shots to show you again what the Central Delta, give you a flavor for the riparian zones along the main channel systems, and then this tremendous system of braided channels that used to exist. Another one like that. So now I'm going to talk about one thing. This is a brand new video, by the way, so you're one of the first to see it. We're trying to convey with this how wild the place used to be, but what was really happening down at the microscopic level in this system. You know we had lots of grizzly bears. We had many salmon, 5-foot-long salmon, so many salmon that there were 12 canneries harvesting 10 million pounds of salmon a year out of the Gulf. But coming into, this is Sherman Island, Jersey Island. We're going to now zoom in and go underwater in just a second here and show you what used to be happening in the Delta relative to what's not happening today. So we go into a tidal marsh. This is at the fringe, and these are tules under high tide. So the water comes up, and I apologize for that feedback. So we'll go underwater, and what you'll see is that the as the water, I'm going to stop. Well, so what happens is the water goes up and fills into these areas. You get a lot of zooplankton production, and then as the tides drain, all of that food comes back into the system. And now you can see on this, once you get a high tide, here comes a high tide, filling up these 400,000 acres of tidal marsh, big spring tide, and then you watch that water drain. And then, so this process was occurring over vast areas at different times, different parts of the tide, North Delta, South Delta. So it was part of the food chain, and it was really what we think was the key driver in creating this vast wild place in the Delta. So what happened starting in the 1860s, 50s and 60s, Chinese laborers got done working on the railroad. They came into the Delta and they started building levees by hand. And then by the late 1800s, clamshell dredges like this one, I don't know, I don't think that's me. Anyway, clamshell dredges like this one came into the Delta and started making levee building much easier, much faster, much cheaper. And so levee construction and draining of islands really picked up when they invented clamshell dredges like this one. So here's just a picture of how they used to then drain the islands and basically mow down these tules so they could start farming. And so we created a Delta we have today. And these are just a series of shots of, showing you the comparison of what it used to look like versus what it looks like today from the air. One of the things you'll see here is how subsidence has occurred. So the water surface, hopefully you can see, is quite a bit higher than the land surface. Another thing that has happened, and I mentioned briefly earlier, but this is a more dramatic view of it, and that is how these channels have been straightened. The historic Delta was a very sinusoidal channel system. So if you're a fish today, you want to go from A to B, you have a relatively short distance to go compared to, and you can see where that historic channel used to exist. The channels used to be very meandering, and part of the levee building was to come in and shorten and straighten these channels. So it's made the Delta, if you will, a smaller place. And I mentioned salmon populations. We have 4 races of salmon in the Delta: winter run, spring run, fall, and late fall run. Historically, we had, as I said, canneries, documentation of 5-foot-long salmon. The lore back then was you could walk across the river on the backs of the salmon. There were so many salmon. And we had these juvenile salmon. So the adults would go up and spawn in the watershed, and then the fry would come down and migrate through the Delta. And as they came through the Delta, I showed you historically the Delta was a very rich place, a lot of food. So the juvenile salmon would come into the Delta and hang out there and get really fat before they would continue their migration out to the ocean. Historically, we had no predators in the Delta system. So these salmon could come in and get fat and not fear getting eaten. Today, however, it's a completely different system. We don't have, 98% of the tidal marsh is gone, the food production is low, very, very low, and we have a lot of predators. And as a result, in the last couple of years, one of the things that I again find amazing, actually sad, is that these juvenile salmon fry on the San Joaquin River, there's a 0% chance of making it out through the Delta. Matter of fact, if you're juvenile salmon, your chances of surviving are better if you take a left turn and go over to the Banks pumping plant and hop a ride on a truck, go 20 miles out to the Sherman Island. Your chances are much better of surviving than if you continue your migration through the Delta. On the Sacramento River system, survival is not much better. 100 kilometers, they're losing about 80% of the salmon are getting eaten or dying on their way through the delta. So it's and one of the things we're seeing on these juvenile salmon, the salmon fry, is that they're actually not gaining any weight, sometimes losing weight, as they come through the delta. Again, there's nothing for them to eat like they used to have on the seasonal floodplains and the tidal marshes. So what happened in 1874, somebody brought 473 striped bass, like this one on the left, and they dumped them into the delta. 25 years later, they were harvesting 1 million pounds of stripers out of the delta. You cut one of these stripers open, and what you find is baby salmon inside of the striper. We have tagged these juvenile salmon, and we can actually watch them getting eaten. You actually tag them and watch them migrating down the river, and all of a sudden, instead of 1 or 2, there's 3, 4, 5, 6, all in a tight clump. That is a self-tagged striper. So one of the things that happened is that the delta pre-1850 was all at sea level. And then when these levees were constructed, as a result of microbial decomposition, as a result of wind-blown erosion, burning, oxidation, compaction, the delta islands, I actually prefer to call them holes, are now quite well below sea level, as much as 30 feet below sea level. We have a hole in the delta today that's about 3 billion cubic meters of void below sea level. To put that in perspective, that's about 3 million acre feet of void. So that's like 3 Diamond Valley reservoirs full of water. We are losing every day in the delta about 2,300 dump truck loads of dirt, just evaporating into the atmosphere as a result of this ongoing subsidence. I showed you how the delta was created. It was a historic wetland. Year after year, as sea level would rise over the last 10,000 years, it would lay down layer upon layer of highly organic peat soil. This peat soil, when exposed to oxygen, will oxidize and release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The delta is currently releasing as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as the entire fleet of Southwest jets that release every day in terms of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. So we have a big hole in the ground. How many of you have been in the Rose Bowl? Probably quite a few of you. If you've been in the Rose Bowl, it would take about 8,000 Rose Bowls full of water to fill this hole back up to sea level. We have a deep hole in the delta. So quickly, I didn't plan to show this, but I thought some of you may not have seen this, but it goes back to my other presentations on risk. Because of subsidence, only because of subsidence, now when we have this big earthquake, it's due, it's coming, we're overdue for a big earthquake. What happens is these levees will liquefy. We've got good documentation, and they do this, they slump. And because we have about 3 billion cubic meters of void below sea level, it will pull first fresh water and then salt water back up into the delta. So we've got a water supply risk that we wouldn't have had absent the subsidence that occurred over the last 150 years. So you can see from this animation, this happens to be the exact hydrology of July 1st, 2002, that water rushing in to fill these former wetland now holes is rushing in, and eventually, I'm going to color the salt water red so you can see it here, but you'll see how the salt water then pulls in from the ocean to fill this void. So here comes the seawater. We're now 5 hours after the earthquake, and the animation timeline will speed up. We're now 17, 18, 20 hours after the earthquake, and seawater is rushing back in to fill this void. Your drinking water supply is right down here in the South Delta, right there at the State Water Project. The other thing we are concentrated on in the Bay Delta system, we have the co-equal goals. You've probably heard of these. The water supply and ecosystem are co-equal goals in the Delta. So not only do we want to have a reliable delta supply of water, but we want to restore some semblance of the delta ecosystem. Because of subsidence, most of the delta now is too deep to do tidal marsh restoration. So we're stuck doing restoration around the ring of the bathtub. These areas that are green and amber colored are the areas that are at the right elevation to do tidal marsh restoration. And one of those areas, I'm going to back up. The area I'm going to show you is right here, right there. And it was a former farm field, used to grow tomatoes, and it breached, the levees breached, was not reclaimed in the Yellow bypass. And nature, all on its own, since 1992, has recreated a very, very nice tidal wetland. This is the kind of habitat where we're finding delta smelt, good food supplies. So it shows you what that nature can reclaim and kind of restore some of these areas back to what they used to be. So a little bit about salt and how that's changed over time. The delta today is, although with the drought, it's getting saltier and saltier. And we had a very scary situation occur a year ago, January, where we had some really high tides, very low delta outflow, and we had about 6% seawater lapping at the edge of the delta. We were potentially going to lose control of the delta. If we get too salty, we wouldn't be able to get the salt back out. But we got a system now where we hold the delta fresh by releasing the reservoir water, go through a brackish system out here to seawater. One of the things that happens is when these levees break, they can either make the delta fresher if these levees break and on the exterior part of the delta, or they can make the delta saltier if they break more towards Sherman Island. So we have a complex system of hydrodynamics in the delta. If you build the tunnels, we currently are exporting about 5,400 tons per day of salt out of the South Delta because of the salinity mixing that's occurring. Building the tunnels would reduce that salt load by over 60%. The salt that is coming down to you is, and the delta waters are very important because they're relatively low in salinity compared to the Colorado River. We need these low salinity waters in order to dilute Colorado River water. So a little bit, a new factoid, this has just come out, which I don't know, you may not find interesting, but I did, and that is that if you look back at that historic deltas I showed you in those earlier animations, very narrow channels, a lot of tidal marsh. Our preconceived notion was that the delta had this big tidal flux, what we call the tidal prism, the distance, the elevation of the volume of water between high tide and low tide. What we found through some recent modeling was that the tidal prism historically is about equal to what it is today. And the reason that is even though all of those tidal marshes have been eliminated, levied off, the channels are now much, much wider. So the channels are taking up that additional volume that the tidal marshes have lost. So how does salt mix into the delta? Currently, this is how it occurs. On French tracts, these flooded islands in the western delta can dramatically, tidally mix salt into the delta. So levee breaks in the western delta have the potential for mixing salt into the delta. This phenomenon would not have existed in the historic delta only because of subsidence and only because of this highly altered system do we have the capability to do this kind of mixing today. So I want to give you kind of the past, present, and future. What is a sustainable delta? We believe that I believe, and UC Davis professors believe that these processes of subsidence and sea level rise and earthquakes are going to dramatically change the delta. So what is it going to look like? Is it going to be an inland lake? If we do nothing, it probably will be. But if we are proactive, if we actually try to think about what we want the delta to look like, this is a vision of the future. What does a sustainable delta look like? Wildlife-friendly agriculture around the periphery, probably some flooded areas in the central delta, but wildlife-friendly subsidence reversal, carbon sequestration, these ecosystem gradients that I showed you earlier. That's kind of where a number of us think we need to be going. So in conclusion, what we need to do, this is kind of bringing it back to the current, based on where we've been and where we're going, we need to separate the ecosystem from the water supply. We've got a system now where we're trying to take water out of an estuary and have that water be low in salinity, low in dissolved organic carbon, and then we also want a vibrant ecosystem. And that's because we're trying to do the same thing in the same place with all these different functions. If we separate the two, we can have a safe, reliable water supply and a vibrant ecosystem. And that's the fundamental premise of the tunnel system, is to separate the two, allow those two to be not in conflict anymore. So with that, I'll conclude. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but doing okay? Do we have any more questions? Or
Sure, why don't we go ahead and do some. First, let's give Curt a hand.
Yeah.
So we have a few minutes for questions. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. Please stand up and so everyone can hear you.
I just received an email from National Science Foundation, and it describes the Bay Delta in New Orleans, that they were very surprised that as the sediments went over the different plates, it didn't subside. So of course, sea level rise will be more dramatic. Is this the same for this delta with that research that I'm sure you may have seen similar for, you say there's more and more sediments, and if that doesn't make the plates subside, then of course sea level rise will be more dramatic.
I have not seen that. I have seen.
Read it. I have.
Yeah.
Maybe I kind of reframe the question. Thank you, sir.
Some research coming out of New Orleans and out of the lower Mississippi Delta in terms of subsidence and some of the deep processes that may occur there and may mitigate some of the sea level rise. And I guess the short answer is I haven't seen anything similar to that coming out of the Delta. We have looked at deep gas extraction, oil extraction in the region, as well as groundwater extraction, and none of those are having any influence on subsidence in the Delta. The Delta subsidence, unlike the San Joaquin Valley, where you read a lot about subsidence, hear a lot about subsidence on the news, the Delta subsidence is entirely a surface process. It's entirely the loss of the soil that's causing the land surface to go down.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Sunshine. As I said, I don't believe in ghosts, spooks, and Jason, but you scare the hell out of me in a very good way. The current mayor of Chicago loves to use the phrase, nothing solves a problem better than a crisis. And in my working for years for 3 and 4-star generals, they used to tell us, tell me what I need to fix it. Don't worry about cost, don't worry about resources, that's my worry. Tell me what I need to do to fix it. So Curt, we make you king. How do you solve the next 100-year problem? What do you do? What do we need as advocates to help you do?
Yeah, so I'm going to preface this by, this is my opinion, and I'm not representing anybody else's, but having worked in the Bay Delta system for over a quarter of a century, and worked on subsidence and water supply and ecosystem, I think the key thing is we need to change the trajectory. We're on a trajectory of trying to maintain the status quo. If you look at processes that are going on in the Bay Delta system right now, there's a lot of inertia to try to hold the same into the future. We believe that ongoing sea level rise, subsidence, earthquake risk are going to change this system whether we do anything or not. And it's going to change dramatically. So we better be proactive, not reactive, and be proactive in terms of isolating our water supply so that it's not subject to salinity intrusion, it's not subject to levee collapses, it's not subject to the Endangered Species Act conflicts that we currently have, it's not subject to the salinity intrusion that we get during droughts. So there are a lot of reasons why we need to move the intake out of the South Delta up to the North Delta. And we also need to then stop this as much as possible, this subsidence process, and reverse it. And we know how to do that. I led a program for 15 years at DWR to show that we can do what nature did over the last 10,000 years. We can actually cause tubing marshes to accrete. And our research shows that once you accrete these land surface elevations back up to sea level, you can reintroduce them, and we could experience 2, 3, 4, 5 feet of sea level rise over the next 50 years, 100 years. And our research shows that these tube marshes can keep up with that. They will accrete and grow. So we have a sustainable system. So the trick is to let nature do the work. But we've got to release nature by breaking down some of these levees and restoring some of these areas so that nature can take over and do what we did on Liberty Island back in 1992, totally by accident, and allow some of this to restore. I would like to go out, I mean, I can only imagine what it would have been like to see 100 grizzly bears, thousands of beavers, 5-foot-long salmon. It would be, I don't know if we're going to ever get back to that, but it would be nice to get back to, the sky was black with birds stories, that there were so many birds you blocked out the sun. These stories that we hear about how wild the Delta used to be, it would be nice to get some of that back in some areas of the Delta where it's still possible. I don't know if that answers.
Well, you're the king.
Very good. Do we have any other questions of Curt? Let's all give Curt a great round.